I love looking at arguments for gods, or even arguments against gods, but all of the arguments ultimately fail because they aren't actually interested in the only thing that actually matters. Truth, fact, evidence, the things that are actually true in the real world. Because what is going on in the real world that we all share, that should be important. More important than, well, it makes me feel good. And most people don't care about that, which I think is eminently sad. So let's take a look at another article. We're going to look at some arguments today, both for and against the existence of gods, from a relatively neutral source. And I think that ultimately neutrality is important because it at least helps eliminate the faith and fifis from these arguments, or at least ratchet it down a little bit, which I think is important. However, I also don't think that this particular article does anything all that useful. So let's get into it and take all of this apart. We're not going to be solving any problems, but maybe we'll start to understand where the real problems lie. 5 arguments for and against the existence of God, a philosophical debate spanning creation, free will, and a sneaky teapot. Okay, we're going to get into all of that eventually, but this really isn't going to go well on the religious side, and I think that's pretty obvious. Granted, this isn't a necessarily religious source, it comes from Big Think after all, but I think it'll be pretty clear as we go on that the religious arguments are complete failures and the secular ones, well, they're not usually that useful either. That's going to bother some people, but give me a chance to explain, which I will do once we actually get to one. And it's not a bad thing, I promise. Anyway, let's continue. So, we start off with a couple of bullet points. Philosophers have debated over the existence of God since the beginning of philosophy. And that's a little strangely formatted, granted, but we'll just muddle through. First off, and this is really going to do away with the entire article up front, but philosophy isn't the proper tool to use for claims of the existence of any god. Philosophy doesn't deal with the real world. All the philosophers that have ever lived can't tell you anything about the existence of any real thing using philosophy. That's the realm of science, not philosophy. Now, if you were going to talk about concepts, that's a different matter, because philosophy can absolutely weigh in on concepts, and that's what it really excels in. But the religious, they aren't saying that their gods are concepts. They are saying that they are real and that they really exist in the real world, and thus philosophy is just an utter waste of time. Just saying. Number 2. Here are 5 arguments for or against the idea that at least one deity exists. But I'm willing to bet that none of them actually get you anywhere demonstrable. And this is really where expectations come in. Now, I can only speak for myself, of course, although I would expect that most atheists would agree, but we're really after the demonstrable truth of the matter. We don't care about what you believe. We don't care about what makes you feel good. We care about what you can prove. We want to see what you can demonstrate is actually going on. And as I said before, philosophy can't do that. Only science can. Only a critical evaluation of the demonstrable facts can establish that any real God actually exists. And they don't have any of that, do they? Because I don't care what you want to believe. I don't care what makes you feel good. I care what you can prove. And absolutely none of these arguments actually get you to a God. Any God, much less your specific God. And I think you'll notice that as we get farther in, that each takes a couple of steps, kind of gets bored, and then just declares, God done it, without ever showing that God exists or has ever done anything at all. We'll talk more about that in a moment, I'm sure. Number 3, each argument has earned at least as many detractors as supporters. Sure, but the pro side are religious zealots who just really want it to be true, whether it is or not, and they don't really care about that. And the anti side, at least most of the time, is looking at the claims being made and saying, that's kind of dumb. That's unsupported. That's not how that works. Of course, the religious don't care because they're just looking for emotional comfort, not verifiable fact, which is also pretty dumb, but we'll get there in a minute, I promise. One of the most enduring problems of philosophy is whether God exists. It has attracted the attention of some of the greatest minds across every philosophical tradition. Here, we look at 5 of the major arguments both for and against the existence of God. Well, as I said, it really isn't because philosophy isn't the proper tool for the job. However, I see armchair philosophers pulling this all the time because I think they want to be more important than they actually are, but that's really neither here nor there, is it? There is no way to get from, here's what I think in my head, to here's what's actually true in the real world. And if we're going to really evaluate religious claims, that is exactly what we need to do. Philosophy is completely worthless in that regard. So let's keep that in mind as we move forward. The cosmological argument. The cosmological argument is fairly straightforward. And we've done the cosmological argument to death already, but here we go again, I guess. This is really the Kalam as presented, since most people, outside of dimwits like Daniel King, they don't even touch the regular cosmological argument anymore because it is so ridiculously easy to defeat. This is too, but it's a little more nuanced, so let's do it. A modern version of it reads, whatever begins to exist must have a cause for its existence. Well, first off, you can't even say that. We haven't observed things that don't have causes. At least, we don't think that they don't have causes. But that's only our observation. For all we know, somewhere out there in the cosmos, someplace we've never seen, things just happen without causes all the time. If you look at quantum mechanics, where things seemingly appear and disappear without any apparent cause, that seems to be the case. But the religious don't want to address that, do they? So this is all just an assertion, and it's a poor one at that, and this is why they tend to go back to old thinkers, because the Kalam was a Muslim invention 800 years ago, 900 years ago, something like that. This is not something that modern thinkers would come up with because it's kind of dumb. It, like so many things that the religious try to use, it's just common sense, where common sense is just wrong a lot of the time. But people cling to it because your general rank and file, they just aren't that bright. So bad premise, unsupported claim, no evidence provided, failed argument. But let's continue anyhow. The universe began to exist. Yeah, we don't actually know that. Our particular instantiation of space-time did, at least that's what the evidence that we currently have shows, but that doesn't mean that everything did. And this is where you really need to get into the definitions, because the religious are often playing fast and loose with words. What do they mean by universe? Find out what they mean and make them stick to it. Do they mean everything that could ever possibly exist? Because most of them do. Because if they do that, then they've just failed, because everything that can possibly exist must include their God, and there goes their argument. No spaceless, timeless nonsense. And it is all nonsense. Simply made up words for convenience by the delusional. Get a specific definition of universe and don't let them try to slip out of it, because they will try. They have to if they want to make any of this stick. Therefore, the universe must have a cause for its existence. Cool, but that doesn't make it a god, does it? And this is why the Kalam is so meaningless, because it doesn't even address gods. You can't just get from some cause to God done it. At least not without filling in a whole lot of details in the middle that they simply do not have. God done it isn't an answer. It's an assertion. And assertions mean nothing without corroboratory evidence, which they simply do not have. They might get into, well, it seems to me, but nobody ought to care about that. We care what you can show is real. We care what you can present evidence for, not what you just cooked up in your head and really want to be true. So, Kalam, dead. But let's see how this gets justified. This line of reasoning generally continues until reaching the idea of an uncaused cause or prime mover. Except those are also just assertions. That's why it is so essential to have them define their terms. If they're using universe to refer to absolutely everything that could ever conceivably exist, then that's not where we live, is it? We have no idea what might exist outside of our own particular instantiation of space-time. Therefore, making bold assertions about what's got to be out there, if there's anything out there at all, it is a complete waste of everyone's time. Remember, we can't assume that the physical laws that we live with every single day exist outside of our little space-time bubble, which the religious are forced to do, because they make observations and say, well, every place is just like this. How do you know that? They can't. They don't. They just really like the idea. Therefore, their entire argument just self-destructs because they're just making a whole bunch of claims that just sound good to them. But that's irrelevant in an intellectual conversation. Don't let them get away with it. Not now, not ever. Variations of the cosmological argument date back as far as ancient Greece. Aristotle's take is particularly influential. The Islamic philosopher, I'm not even going to bother, made a similar case, and St. Thomas Aquinas redefined it. Its modern defenders include Robert Kuhns and William Lane Craig. Yeah, sorry, none of that is impressive. Now, we do know about Aquinas and Lowbar Bill, but what about Robert Kuhns? He brought it up, might as well. Just like all the rest, he's a Christian with a theological axe to grind. He just really wants to believe, which is why he flogs these dead horses so hard. You don't find people who support these ideas if they're not already religious, do you? You don't find people who support them on the basis of the strength of the ideas alone. Never happens. It's always, but I really want to believe. There might be a little bit of bias there, right? I don't know. You tell me. It certainly is intuitive. The idea of getting something from nothing, potentially including the entire cosmos, is unsatisfying. But who cares about your satisfaction? That's the problem. This whole thing is just more of that common sense stuff, which we all know isn't that common. It's asking people with no particular knowledge what they think about things and expecting them to come up with coherent answers. True answers. And that doesn't work very well, does it? The actual underpinnings of the universe are not obvious because we do not live on that level that the universe actually operates on. We don't have any real experience with that in our day-to-day lives. It's why common sense means nothing. It's why you don't consult with idiots when you're trying to discover the truth. They have no basis in the actual facts. But as we all know from the religious, they just don't care, do they? And until recently, philosophers viewed the idea of an infinite regress with extreme suspicion, further favoring the need for an uncaused creator. But like every other argument on the list, there are strong objections to this one. Again, because philosophers have no actual connections to the fundamental underpinning of reality. Most of philosophy is just, it seems to me, which is completely meaningless. And I know it makes a lot of people happy, but too bad. This isn't about happy, this is about real. Most people don't care about real, including the vast majority of philosophers, which is why philosophy is completely worthless when dealing with real-world problems. It's why, if you sit down with 10 philosophers, you're going to get 10 different answers to any question that you could ask. But I like it is really what most of them are going to say. Maybe not in those words exactly, but that's really what they're doing. And this is not something that you ought to be proud of. It's just not. David Hume argued that while we assume that everything in our lives has a cause, that assumption does not necessarily apply to the universe as a whole. If so, then there's no need for a prime mover. Bertrand Russell argued that if the universe's proposed creator is exempted from needing a creator, then we can say the same for the universe itself. Others have pointed out that even if the cosmological argument has merit, which it doesn't tell us anything about any creator. For all we know, the universe might have been created by a group of depressed purple giraffes. Yep, pretty much what I said. This is why you can't just start with a conclusion that you really like for emotional reasons and then just try desperately to get back to it because it provides emotional comfort. And that's all religion is doing. Religion is not trying to solve anything. It is trying to make people happy, mostly as a means of extracting the contents of their wallets into the collection plate. Let's be honest about that too, although it's not particularly important in the current discussion. These people are after your money. They don't really care about the truth. They care about putting your butt in the pew week after week after week so you'll keep paying them. That's just how that works. But if we're looking out for the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, then we can't start out with our fee-fees. We have to start out with the evidence that we have and not care where we wind up, not care how the conclusion makes us feel, so long as the conclusion is actually true, so long as the conclusions are actually supported by the evidence. Then we just need to grow up and learn to deal with it. And that's something a lot of people have a real problem with, isn't it? I guess now we're on to the second argument, the problem of evil. The problem of evil is the most famous argument against the existence of an all-powerful and loving God. It's also old. For example, it provides the central theme of the Book of Job in the Abrahamic traditions. But its best-known formulation came from the Greek philosopher Epicurus sometime around 300 BC. But the problem of evil, at least as far as I'm concerned, it has nothing at all to do with the actual existence of any god. It only debunks specific formulations of gods, but those formulations, they're just made up to begin with. And this is another problem with the religious, because they're happy to tell you what their gods are like, but they can't actually show how they got there, not demonstrably, not with evidence. They just really like the idea. But as I've said, liking the idea means nothing. You have to actually want the truth, and the religious, no matter how hard they protest, they just don't. They just want comfort. They just want to be happy. They just want to get a dopamine shot in the noggin day after day after day. Truth isn't remotely important. And this is why I've said in the past that the religious and the skeptical, they're not even speaking the same language. We do not want the same things. It's why most conversations between the two go completely sideways, because they are not being rational. They are only being emotional. And the only thing your emotions do in cases like this is get in the way. But he was talking about Epicurus, wasn't he? So let's get back to that. In his words, is God willing to prevent evil but unable? Then he's not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then from whence comes evil? And this is why it's not really about the existence of any gods, but about the characteristics artificially attached to them. The religious, they can't show how they know that God is omnipotent. They just really like the idea. They also can't show that he's omniscient or that he's omnibenevolent. Those are just ideas that they cooked up in their heads that they really, really like. Other people who like the idea put it down in a book that they like, but how did those people know it? This is a never-ending circle of empty claims and wishful thinking. Therefore, we cannot reconcile the world as we see it with the characteristics that they've just magically stapled onto their gods. Something has to give, and since the real world is unlikely to be wrong because, it's demonstrably real, then those characteristics that have no objective origins, they have to be. Of course, they're also emotionally attached to those ideas, so getting them to change their minds is highly unlikely. But something has to give if we're going to have a coherent, rational conversation. And that's why we don't have a lot of coherent, rational conversations with the religious, do we? A modern variation by philosopher Paul Draper moves away from whether the problem renders a loving God logically impossible. His version leans toward the question of probability. Gratuitous evils exist. The real thing he's probably talking about here is teleological evil. It has to do with all of the evils that just are Nobody causes them, they just are. Now, keep in mind that evil is hardly even a thing in the real world. It's just a label that we slap on things that we don't like. But I'm referring to things like worms that eat children's eyeballs, stuff like that. Stuff that happens through no fault or choice of anyone with a brain. Nobody made this stuff happen except perhaps for God. And since Paul Draper is an atheist, he's not going to be arguing for the Christian deity. However, let's just continue. The hypothesis of indifference, that is, if there are supernatural beings, then they are indifferent to gratuitous evils, is a better explanation for the first point than theism. Actually, it's kind of worse than that when it comes to most of the omniproperty gods, because you cannot argue that they didn't know what they were doing because their knowledge is supposedly perfect. They know what they're doing, and they know all the consequences that will come out of doing it. They knew absolutely everything that would ever happen before they did it. Since they have perfect knowledge of absolutely everything, then whatever actions they take, they must be intentional. And that means that God must have wanted worms to eat the eyes of children. It must have wanted cancer. It must have wanted storms that kill millions of people. God is a dick. God must have wanted all of the senseless teleological evils that exist in the world, because if he didn't, then those evils simply couldn't exist. Which again, as I said, that just makes God a dick. There is no way to square the world that we see today with the God described by Christians and a lot of other religions to boot. Either their conceptions of God are wrong, which they don't want to admit to, or their gods just aren't real. Pick one. Because as the article finishes up here, therefore, evidence prefers that no God, as commonly understood by theists, exists. On a more personal level, the French Catholic priest Jean Méliès denounced his theism because he saw the problem of evil as one of many proofs that no God existed. American philosopher John Rawls abandoned Christianity after witnessing the horrors of World War II and the Holocaust. But it was Holocaust survivor Primo Levi who put it most succinctly: "There is Auschwitz, so there cannot be God." All of those are good points, although if we're going to be honest about it, that doesn't prove that no gods exist, only that no omniproperty gods exist. Evil gods could exist, and the problem of evil would cause no problems for them whatsoever. It's just that lots and lots of people don't want their gods to be evil. They don't want such gods to be real, or at least they want good gods to counterbalance the evils of the world. This is why I say that pretty much no theist is actually concerned with real gods. They're only after the rosy imaginary concepts in their heads. What they've just made up, it doesn't actually exist. They can't make a case that it does. It just makes them feel good to think that this imaginary man in the sky that they've just come up with is real. But the second you start asking any probing questions, the whole thing falls apart, doesn't it? They don't care if it's real. And I've said this repeatedly, they get mad at me, but they don't. Because if they did, they'd have much better answers for, well, how do you know, than they do. They don't know, and they don't care. And they get really mad when I suggest that that's the case. But obviously it is the case, or they would have done something to validate their own beliefs before I asked, beyond just wishing that it was true. And that's why I went looking to see if there was evidence for the Bible and God. Because I actually cared. I got my ass out of the pew, and I did my own research, and I didn't take no for an answer. I didn't say, well, my faith says that God is real, so God is real. That's not how that works. Most Christians never do that because they really don't want to know. They just really want to believe. Of course, there are counter-arguments to the problem of evil. The most famous is the argument from free will. Proponents of this take, such as St. Augustine, argue that the need for free will is great enough to allow certain evils to exist. These evils are caused primarily by the improper use of free will, and divine intervention against any evil caused by free will would be an even greater evil. Except those aren't counter-arguments when you start looking at teleological evil, since free will has absolutely nothing to do with any, say, guinea worms which enter the bloodstream and grow to cause blisters as the fully grown worm tries to erupt from the skin. Now, that doesn't usually kill people, but it is really, really painful, and it lasts sometimes for years. Are we supposed to think that these worms intentionally cause harm, or is this just part of their natural reproductive cycle? Therefore, free will is entirely irrelevant. It doesn't matter because it doesn't even enter into the discussion rationally. This is another place where the religious just change the subject because they have no intelligent answers to this. Well, it's a mystery. But we're not looking for calls to mystery. We're looking for answers, and their theology makes no sense when considering these questions rationally. And you'll get some other ridiculous excuses like, well, the devil did it. But that's not demonstrable either, is it? This is just, well, I've run out of other options, and I don't want to lose my faith, so I'm just going to make something up and run away. But that's not impressing anyone. It just isn't. John Hick suggested that the existence of evil is necessary for the moral growth needed to develop a soul. Others have argued that evil as an independent substance does not exist, and still others claim that what evil does exist is the minimal amount logically possible. That right there is just a bald rationalization, which we see from the religious all the time. When you don't have an actual answer and you think you need one, you just make one up. This happens constantly in religious discussions because I think the religious are finally reaching the point that most of them know they can't just rely on faith alone, and mysteries don't mean anything. People aren't going to take that anymore. They want actual answers, and the religious are loath to say, we don't know. That's why most of them believe in gods to begin with. They want to know, and when they don't, they just make something up, which is how we got religion in the first place. Ignorance and pride, they are not a good combination, are they? It's worth noting that the problem of evil only applies to certain conceptions of deities, notably all-powerful, all-knowing, and benevolent ones. This argument does not rule out the capricious Greek gods, Spinoza's pantheism, or the disinterested God of the deists. The problem is less a concern for many Eastern religions too. Well, I've already made that point, but how many people actually worship the Greek gods or are pantheists today? There are some, of course, but not a whole lot, and it's not what you're likely to run into on a daily basis. No, mostly you're going to get Christians and Muslims, at least in the Western world, although that is really changing these days. I can't remember the last time I just randomly ran into a theist preaching out in the open. Now, maybe I just don't hang out where they do. I don't know. I mean, I see videos where they're on college campuses and the like, but my school days are long gone. Even there, though, people just show up to make fun of them. They don't convert anyone, and half the time, they're only doing it to show to their congregations after some heavy editing and whipping away the microphone when things get too dangerous. We've seen all of that, too. These people are neither smart nor honest, and that's where we're going to stop for the day because I think this is getting pretty long. What do you think so far, though? I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I am honestly not interested in the vast majority of these arguments, and we'll get into the real reasons for that next time, but mostly it's just a whole bunch of people expressing unsupported opinions and not really caring if any of it is true. They just really want to feel good, and if that's all anybody's after, then what the hell is the point? I want actual answers, real answers, defensible answers, not just coddling and comfort, and sadly, that's what most people are after. So until next week, make sure you care about more than your own fee-fees, actually go after the truth, and don't let anybody else get in your way. Because there are so many people out there that are wrong, and they just don't care, do they? Can Big Think actually show the truth, or are they not even trying? And that's one of the many questions we're going to ask ourselves today, and find, sadly, that most people just don't care. I do, but I know I'm largely alone. Even others who say they want the truth, they're largely not being honest, or at least not across the board. They want some truths and not others. I want all of them, no matter how that makes me feel, because my feelings don't matter. So let's go take a look. We're back with the last part of the article on Big Thing. Sadly, I don't think it's going to be any better than the last one was. At least, they aren't openly biased in their conclusions, but I don't think they're actually after any real conclusions at all, do you? This really seems like, well, here's both sides, make up your own mind, instead of trying to get to anything demonstrably true. Because there is an actual answer somewhere, but nobody is in any rush whatsoever to go out and find it. Far too many are just trying to straddle that line so that they don't offend anybody, and that's not me. That never has been me, never will be me. I don't care about anyone getting offended. I care about figuring out what's actually going on. So let's dive back in and see if we get any better, but I wouldn't be holding my breath. The teleological argument, also known as the argument from design. The teleological argument claims that the world's complexity proves a designer exists. Except it doesn't, because complexity is just an interpretation, not a demonstrable reality. This goes right back to, I don't get it, therefore God. But that doesn't prove that any gods are real, and certainly not any specific ones that anybody actually believes in. This is just, well, it's going to fill in this blank with an answer that I find emotionally comforting, so I'm going to just claim it's God. But that doesn't make it real. The whole thing is just a complete waste of time. But we're here, so let's look at it anyhow. The argument is, again, rather straightforward. Human-made objects were created with intention, by design, and for a purpose. And we can actually demonstrate that they were, in fact, human-designed. We can show that humans designed them, built them, and put them out there. There's no such demonstration with any gods. The universe resembles human-made objects in important ways. No, it doesn't. It looks absolutely nothing at all like that. This is interpretation, not reality. We can show that humans make stuff because we have direct, demonstrable, and repeatable examples of humans doing exactly that. We have none of that when it comes to gods. We can't even show that gods are real. This is just wishful thinking. This is what some people want to be true. But that doesn't make it true, does it? Therefore, it is probable that the universe was created with intention, by design, for a purpose. And how in the hell did you calculate that probability? Saying it's probable doesn't mean anything. What is that based on exactly, and how did you figure it out? It seems to me is not a rational answer. There is no way to even statistically calculate the odds, is there? We only have one universe to evaluate. How do we tell the difference between a universe that is designed and one that's not without more than one example to go by? And this is especially true when the religious think that everything was designed by their imaginary friend in the first place. So how do they determine what was designed and what was not designed when they have already concluded that absolutely everything is? If everything is, how do you tell the difference? They can't. This is just another question that they have absolutely no answers for, isn't it? Well, it looks designed to me. But that's not evidence that it is, in fact, designed. You have to have some kind of external methodology to determine it, and they don't have any, do they? Because they really want it to be true. That doesn't mean anything. The universe is much more complex than human-made objects. Therefore, it is probable that a powerful being designed the universe. But that's just bullshit that they yanked out of their asses. This is all just coddling of their emotional wishes and dreams. And that doesn't make any of it true. Until they can come up with some actual evidence that shows that the universe was designed by a demonstrable designer that they can provide evidence for, this is just a complete waste of everybody's time. Knock it off. This argument dates back to at least Socrates. However, the Stoic philosophers developed the argument into many forms we still see today. The Islamic philosopher Averroes endorsed it. A story about Ravi Meir makes a direct reference to it, and even Isaac Newton supported it. Now, I might have screwed up some of those names a little bit, but hey, that's life. Of course, most of those people were already religious and starting from religious preconceptions, so of course they accepted something that made their existing religious beliefs look more valid. But that doesn't make any of it actually true. That's why I tell people that they need to go back to step one and justify their beliefs all the way down. Take faith completely out of the picture because your faith doesn't mean anything. Now, sometimes that's not possible. We all have to agree that we just exist and share a real world before we can even have a coherent conversation about anything else. But the religious have to do the same thing, so they've got nothing to complain about here. I always thought it funny when solipsists insist that they're the only ones that are real, be they a brain in a vat or whatever, yet they're the ones out there playing make-believe contact with non-existent minds, doing things on a non-existent internet, stuff like that, trying to rationalize their own beliefs to entities that they don't even think are real. It just makes you roll your eyes at the irony. Yeah, but whatever. Anyhow, but the most famous version of it was put forward by William Paley in his watchmaker analogy. He imagines what we would say if we had to explain how a watch we found on the ground got there. As he puts it, the inference we think is inevitable, that the watch must have had a maker, that there must have existed at some time and in some place or other an artificer or artificers who formed it for the purpose which we find it actually to answer. And I'm sorry, but Paley isn't anybody you should hold up as a great defender of your faith. Even in Paley's own time, people were pointing out just how dumb the watchmaker argument was. And I've done that before, so there's no real reason to do it again. But I will address the last bit, where he said that we must have a maker, and then he just leaps to, well, that maker's God, which of course he did, and theists have been doing the exact same thing since the advent of religion. Just because you really want your God to be true, that doesn't mean that your God is true. Just because you really want your God to have done it, it doesn't mean your God done it. And that's why I keep asking, how do you know that? And I just watch them squirm as they realize that they have no coherent answer. I am not now, nor will I ever be interested in what you believe. I don't care what you have faith in. I care only what you can demonstrate to me with demonstrable evidence. And if you can't demonstrate any of it to me, then you've got no business believing in it yourself. Your faith is entirely empty. And that's not really much of a surprise, is it? Of the arguments for the existence of a God, this one has perhaps the greatest connection to the parts of our lives outside of philosophy. It asks us to consider the world's beauty, the depths of the mysteries of nature, the intricacies of the environment, and what those mean for how we understand the world and how it came to be. And this is the worst example of, well, I don't get it, therefore God. It's why all of this is such a complete waste of time. Just because you don't understand it, that doesn't mean God done it. Now, it's fine to look at the world and wonder. That's healthy to at least a certain degree. Yet, until you have any actual evidence for how it happened, the only coherent, rational answer you can give is, I don't know. God done it isn't a rational answer unless you have evidence that God actually done it. So let us know when you have some, and I don't think we should be holding our breath, but the religious have none and they don't actually care, do they? And I still find it funny watching the religious whine, but we care, when it's demonstrable that they don't. If they cared, then they would put their beliefs to the test. They would set aside faith as I did, and they would go out and see what the real evidence actually shows. Because if their beliefs are true, then the real evidence should point directly and demonstrably to those beliefs. But they don't want to do that, do they? I believe it isn't enough. It isn't even close. Yet, how many theists have the balls to actually put their beliefs to the test? Not a lot, right? And the ones that do, they don't stay theists for long. Beautiful as that thought is, the teleological argument has still earned its detractors. As David Hume noted, this world is far from perfect, and if a deity made it, then that deity must be an inferior one. He also asserted that we cannot say if this universe is well designed, as we haven't seen any others. Voltaire pointed out that the designer in this argument doesn't have to be a god. Meanwhile, other thinkers have argued that the analogy between man-made objects and the entirety of reality is invalid. And all of those are perfectly adequate points, which I've already made. It's why I don't get it, therefore God is a completely pointless statement, yet it is what most of the classical philosophical arguments depend on. There must have been something, and that thing must have been my God. Yeah, but those are two entirely separate questions, aren't they? Just because you get emotional comfort from thinking it's your God, that doesn't make it your God or any God whatsoever. It's why I insist that they walk me through the steps, the rational steps, not based on faith or fifis, to make sure that they're not just leaping over a couple in their mad dash towards religious confirmation bias. Because they all are. Show me exactly how you got there, because therefore God means nothing unless you have demonstrated that your God is verifiably real. It doesn't matter what you want to be true. It doesn't matter what you have faith in. It matters what you can show actually is. Get to work. So on to the next one. Russell's teapot. One of the more whimsical arguments against the existence of any gods was put forward by Bertrand Russell, and like any number of the British aristocracy in good standing, the third Earl Russell invoked tea in his argument. This is the one that the religious just don't understand, and I think that's pretty much on purpose. I have seen them pretend that atheists actually think there's a teapot circling Mars or whatever. I have seen them claim that we have faith that there's a teapot out there. No, that's not how this works. The whole point of the argument is to show that faith is completely pointless, meaningless, utterly useless. If you can't show that there is a teapot, then believing that there is a teapot is utterly idiotic. Just as if you can't show that there is a God, then believing that there is a God, it's just dumb. Yet this is what beliefs in God are based on in almost all circumstances, aren't they? You just have to have faith. No, you don't. You absolutely shouldn't. You should never, ever, ever have faith, at least not the Hebrews 11:1 variety. Yet it does get worse, doesn't it? He asked his readers to suppose that he was seriously advancing the idea of a teapot floating in orbit around the sun. This teapot is also impossible to detect. The question then, is it on you to disprove the impossibility of this teapot's existence, or is it his responsibility to prove that it's real? Yet we see theists all the time saying that somehow it's our job to prove their imaginary friends aren't real, right? It's not their job to prove that their gods exist. They have faith, and that just means it has to be true. We have to prove them wrong, and then, like people like William Lane Craig and Ken Ham have said, even if we could, they'd still believe it because they have the witness of the Holy Spirit or whatever bullshit Craig makes up in his head, so he can sleep better at night. People do not understand the basic burden of proof. They really don't. They just go with what they want to be true, and since it would be emotionally uncomfortable to admit that they might not be right, they simply double down on their own fifis and faith and pretend that they just can't be wrong. Any positive claim bears the burden of proof, even for mundane claims. Now, whoever you're making the claim to, they might not call for your evidence, but that doesn't mean that you're not responsible for defending it if they do. If you say that you have a dog, that's a very mundane claim. Tons of people have dogs. We know dogs are real. but I don't have to accept your claim without comment. I can insist to see pictures of your dog. I could ask you to trot your dog out. If you want me to believe you, then it is solely on your own shoulders to produce that evidence that I'm asking for. Otherwise, I have no reason at all to believe that you're telling the truth. I don't have to believe you. Now, you might not care if I believe you. That's another thing entirely. But the burden of proof comes from me. I impose that on you. You don't get to pick it for yourself. That's not how that works. Now, that doesn't mean that you're wrong if I say, prove it to me, and you don't. It just means that you have failed to justify and validate your claims to me. And that's why I don't play the extraordinary claims thing necessarily. It goes for all claims, not just extraordinary ones. It's just that with most ordinary claims, people aren't usually going to call you out on it, but they certainly could, and your responsibility is if they do. The responsibility to answer all objections with evidence is yours, not mine. If nobody asks, then you probably don't have to present the evidence, but you still should be able to regardless. If the person claiming to have the dog lives in a strict Muslim majority country where having dogs is incredibly rare because they're sinful or whatever the fuck it is, then it's no longer an ordinary claim, is it? I damn well will be asking you to back it up, and if you don't, I'm not going to believe you. That's how it actually works. Russell's point was that anyone making such a claim is the one who must prove it, not the person objecting to it. And since nobody takes arguments of a spacefaring teapot seriously, why then should we treat other arguments as sacred? Perhaps the greatest legacy of the argument is that its use as a tool to remind users where the burden of proof lies when the assertion is made. And if you're not into tea, Carl Sagan once made a similar point about the impossible to detect dragon living in his garage. There are lots of examples, and the religious will be perfectly happy with all of them, except their own gods. This is why I point out that we do not need and should never accept double standards. One standard for everything, that's really all we need. So long as everything is equivalent, then playing these ridiculous word games should never be accepted. And that's where a lot of people, especially when it comes to faith, go horribly awry. It's why I take faith off the table immediately. If you can't justify your positions without blind faith, then you've got no business believing it in the first place. The relevance of this analogy to existing religions has been debated. One common objection is that it would be difficult to hide the evidence of sending a teapot to space. Another is that while no reasonable person is arguing that a star-trekking teapot exists, there are reasonable people who maintain that there is a God. Except I don't really think that there are. There are people who want to be seen as reasonable who maintain that there is a God, but it doesn't mean any of them are actually reasonable, because actually reasonable people don't take ridiculous, unreasonable positions. I'm sure that the people who pretend that the earth is flat, they want to be seen as reasonable too, although most people would disagree. I'm sure that the people that think they've seen Bigfoot, they want to be seen as reasonable too. Same thing applies. Wanting to be reasonable and being reasonable, those are two entirely different things. Just asserting that you're reasonable doesn't make you reasonable. And the same thing goes with rationality. That's why we have standards to begin with, so that we can gauge those claims against those standards to see if they stand up. We don't care about your fifis, and we don't care about your faith. And as we know, that's all most of these people are concerned with. So, no, I don't think it's reasonable or rational to claim that any gods exist, at least not until demonstrable evidence has been presented to show that they actually do. If you can't come up with that and yet still believe, then you've got some issues, and that's your problem, not ours. Finally, we get to the last argument, which sadly is equally unimpressive. The ontological argument. Our last argument is certainly the most abstract. It is also, perhaps, both the most interesting from a philosophical point of view and the easiest to dismiss as ridiculous. As René Descartes put it, if there is a God, it is a perfect being. Really? Says who? Because there are certainly a lot of gods that have been proposed over the years that are not described at all as being perfect. Pretty much nothing in the Greek or Roman pantheons are even close. They are all capricious, jealous deities with all the same foibles as humans because, humans just made them up, just like all the gods. And if you look at the Abrahamic God, you've got the same failings. Exodus 34:14, which says that God is a jealous God. Well, that's not a perfect being. The Bible is full of God throwing childish temper tantrums, committing mass murder, demanding worship, etc., etc., etc. These are not signs of a perfect God. So Descartes was just wrong on that one, and just like he was wrong on a lot of other things in my opinion. But let's continue. A perfect being possesses all possible perfections. Again, says who? Because we've already done away with the whole perfect being thing, at least as it applies to the Abrahamic God, and it pretty much goes for all gods anyway. This just shows that the religious aren't referencing a real demonstrable being. They're just following around the made-up images that they have in their heads, and this is incredibly common. How do you know that? Needs to be asked a whole lot more here, and sadly, most people don't push it nearly as far as they should. Absolutely nothing should be accepted without evidence, which is one reason the religious don't really want to talk to us, because we ask too many hard questions. However, that aside, onward. Existence is a perfection. Again, says who? Because I can do this all day. There's a difference between assertions and facts. Just because Descartes wanted existence to be a perfection, that doesn't mean that it is. This is really where philosophy tends to go off the cliff a lot, because it's based on assertions with no defensible way to back any of it up. That's why it's filled with warring camps. Well, it sounds good to me. What difference does that make? It doesn't sound good to us. I mean, this whole thing is stupid. Who cares? If we're after fact, which we should be, then taking individual wishes and dreams out of the picture, that has to be on the first of our list of things to do. I don't care how you feel. I don't care what you like. I don't care what you wish was true. I don't care about your faith. I care what you can demonstrate in the real world that we have all basically agreed exists. Besides, existence isn't a characteristic that you can just randomly assign to something. Either a thing actually exists or it doesn't. It's not a perfect thing. It's a real thing, and it needs to be demonstrable. Invisible, intangible, universe-creating pixies are perfect, thus they need to exist. But that doesn't make them real, does it? The whole thing is just idiotic. Therefore, God necessarily possesses the quality of existence, which is still not how that works. This is a really dumb one, and sadly, it's not really any worse than anything else the religious have to say. So let's just get into the justification, because I don't think they're going to be any better than what we've already seen. This is based on a similar argument advanced by St. Anselm. Avicenna made a related argument in the Islamic world, and the ancient Greek poet-philosopher Xenophanes authored similar ideas in some of the oldest extant philosophy, and in his younger years, Bertrand Russell was convinced by this argument, though, as you've probably guessed, he later rejected it. But see, it doesn't matter who suggested it, or liked it, or disliked it. All of that is utterly irrelevant to reality. I get so sick and tired of people tossing names around going, but this person said so. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who said it. It only matters if it's true. An argument works, or doesn't work, solely based on its own merits, not on who might have thought it up, or who might have thought it was a good idea, or whatever else. Far too many people get into this kind of absurd hero worship, and that just pisses me off. I don't care about Anselm or Aquinas or anybody else. Throwing names around doesn't make the arguments any better or any worse. Can we just stop that, please? Defend the argument on its own merits. I don't need a history lesson. I don't care. The primary counterargument is that existence is not part of the concept of something, a quality or a predicate. This approach was first formulated by Immanuel Kant, a Christian himself. Russell came to agree with Kant, although he still found the original argument to be well structured. And he's still doing it. Knock it off. None of this actually matters. Structure doesn't mean anything. And this is why I get sick and tired of people arguing over structure. Oh, but my syllogism is valid. I don't care. I care if it's true. I care if it is sound logically, rationally, and evidentially. Structure doesn't mean anything. It might make it a little bit easier to understand and break down, but it has nothing at all to do with whether or not it's true. St. Thomas Aquinas objected to Anselm's version of the argument, as it more explicitly requires us to understand the essence of God. If this is impossible, as he and many subsequent thinkers maintained, this argument can't possibly prove anything. In modern times, William Rowe suggests that the argument presupposes the existence of God. And, of course, this too is meaningless as well. Aquinas disagreed with Anselm because he didn't like the consequences. He liked his version of God, but not Anselm's version of God. But since neither of them are demonstrably real, who cares? This is where we have these problems, and we do have these problems a lot. Your faith and your fifis mean nothing. But we see these criticisms constantly. But that's not what God is like. Well, how the hell do you know that? I didn't ask you what you believed. I didn't ask about your faith. I asked you how you know. What can you demonstrate is actually true in the real world that we all share? And of course, they don't have any answers for that, do they? Yet they should, you'd think. They should have answers, and we need to hold them accountable for having those answers and showing us how they got there. And until they do have those answers, all the arguments that they make are going to continue to fail time and time again. Because at the end of the day, if we're not getting to truth, then we're just wasting our time. And I don't mean, well, it sounds good to me. I don't mean, I really like it. I mean actual, demonstrable, factual, evidentially validated, true for absolutely everybody in the real world that we all share truth. If you're not doing that, if you're not after that, then you are an idiot. If you're only after your own personal emotional comfort, then you are an idiot. And for a ton of people, religious and non-religious alike, they don't actually care about the truth, do they? They're just looking to coddle their own fifis and feel better about their position in what can be a scary world. But I don't care about that. Not remotely. It's why all of these articles that we look at fail, because they aren't actually looking for the fundamental foundation of verifiable reality. And that's verifiable reality, because they don't care. The second that anyone doesn't care, as we pretty much know most people don't, they've lost. I'm really tired of talking to losers. Most people out there are. Losers, I mean, and I find that immensely sad, don't you?